When you think of a great detective, your mind probably goes to someone sharp, imposing, and perhaps a bit cold. You might think of Sherlock Holmes with his magnifying glass and his clinical detachment, or perhaps a hard-boiled investigator in a trench coat. But G.K. Chesterton gives us someone entirely different. Father Brown is a priest. He is short, dishevelled, and looks perpetually as if he has just stepped out of a heavy rainstorm. He is easy to overlook, and that is precisely why he is so effective. He doesn't look for clues in the way a scientist does, he looks for them in the way a confessor does. He understands the mechanics of sin, and because he knows the darkness inside the human heart, he can see through the illusions people use to hide it. The stories in the wisdom of Father Brown aren't just puzzles to be solved. They are explorations of the gap between what we see and what is actually happening. In the very first story, we meet a man named Dr. Orion Hood. Hood is a man of rigid, scientific precision. He relies on forensic evidence and logical deduction to solve a blackmail plot in Scarborough. He sees a crime scene and looks for the physical traces left behind. But Brown looks at the same scene and sees something else entirely. He realizes that the entire setup is a piece of stagecraft. The man they are investigating, a lodger named James Todhunter, isn't just a criminal, he's a professional conjurer. Brown realizes that the mystery was actually a magic trick. This sets the tone for everything that follows. The world is full of people performing illusions, and Brown's job is to look past the sleight of hand to find the mundane, often messy, reality underneath. As we move through the collection, the scale of these illusions grows. In the Italian Apennines, we see how a seemingly supernatural or chaotic event, a carriage accident involving a band of brigands, is actually a carefully choreographed performance by actors. The chaos is a mask for a very human, very desperate act of embezzlement. In Paris, Brown deals with a spy's note that contains accurate inaccuracies. The spy has intentionally included specific errors to signal a hidden message. Here, Brown shows us that even when someone tries to be clever or deceptive with language, they are still bound by the patterns of human communication. One of the most fascinating concepts Brown introduces is the law of opposites. He observes a man who is so perfectly disguised as the opposite of his true self that he becomes effectively invisible. If a man is naturally loud and boisterous, making him quiet and timid doesn't just change his behavior, it creates a void where his true identity used to be. People don't see him because they aren't looking for a man who is the exact opposite of what they expect. This idea ties into a recurring theme in the book: the fallibility of human perception. We think we see the world clearly, but we are constantly being deceived by our own expectations and our own senses. This is most vividly illustrated in the case of the actress Aurora Rome. Witnesses claim to have seen a monstrous, terrifying figure in a darkened theatre. They were convinced of its presence. But Brown reveals the truth. The monster was nothing more than their own distorted reflections in sliding mirror panels. They weren't seeing a demon. They were seeing themselves, twisted by the angle of the glass. It is a powerful metaphor for the way humans often project their own fears and distortions onto the world around them. We see what we are prepared to see, and often we see something much more frightening than the reality. This intersection of science and intuition is a constant tension in the book. We see it again with a scientific device called a psychometric machine, which is supposed to detect the residue of a person's presence in a room. Brown argues that such machines are fundamentally unreliable because the person operating them is never truly objective. The operator's own subconscious, their own expectations and anxieties, will inevitably influence the results. Science attempts to remove the human element, but Brown knows that the human element is the very thing that dictates the truth. This leads us into some of the more unsettling stories, like the case of Arthur Carstairs. Carstairs is a man driven by an obsessive need to maintain his family's social standing and his own private collection of Roman coins. He uses a false nose and a series of disguises to extort his own sister, all under the guise of protecting the family reputation. In the end, his obsession becomes his undoing. He is caught in a web of his own making, unable to reconcile the man he is with the image he has spent his life constructing. His suicide is the tragic result of a man who could no longer bear the weight of his own facade. As the book progresses, the mysteries move from the psychological into the realm of the impossible. We encounter the Duke of Exmoor, a man who uses a family legend of a physical deformity to hide behind a purple wig. He uses a myth to bolster his aristocratic mystery, turning a personal secret into a piece of social theatre. Then there is the Pendragon Tower, where sounds and red lights that seem like something out of a ghost story are revealed to be the result of a very earthly, very violent struggle during a fire. The book reaches its climax by looking at how even the most grand or historical mysteries can be reduced to simple human impulses. In the case of Prince Otto, we are presented with a death that seems almost legendary or political in its implications. The prince died in a fortified, disarmed sanctuary, a place where no one should have been able to reach him. It felt like a grand conspiracy, a political assassination from a bygone era. But Brown peels back the layers of legend to find a much more pathetic truth. It wasn't a grand plot, it was a tragedy of greed and misunderstanding. The prince had been driven by a desire for treasure, and in his greed he had been gagged by his servants to keep him quiet. A sentry, hearing a muffled struggle and seeing movement in the dark, mistook the prince's desperate attempts to breathe for the movements of an intruder and shot him. The legend was just a cover for a series of clumsy human errors. When we step back from the individual plots, a clear pattern emerges in Chesterton's work. The central tension is almost always the conflict between appearance and reality. People wear masks, but those masks aren't always meant to hide a crime. Sometimes they're meant to hide a person's true self, or to protect a social status, or to maintain a sense of dignity. There are physical disguises, like the false nose or the purple wig, but there are also psychological and social facades. We build these layers to navigate the world, but they often end up becoming prisons. Brown's method is unique because it is rooted in the idea that to solve a crime, you have to understand the soul of the criminal. He doesn't just look at the how of a crime, he looks at the why. He understands that the specific nature of a crime, whether it is a theft, a lie, or a murder, reveals something fundamental about the person who committed it. He makes a distinction between small sins, which are often just lapses in judgment or moments of weakness, and large sins, which are driven by deep-seated passions like envy or greed. To Brown, a crime is a window into the character of the person who committed it. This is why he is such a perfect foil to the more scientific characters like Dr. Hood. The scientist looks at the evidence and tries to reconstruct the past through logic. Brown looks at the evidence and tries to understand the heart. He knows that human beings are not purely rational creatures. We are driven by impulses, contradictions, and a desperate need to be seen in a certain way. If you only look at the logic, you will miss the person. Ultimately, the wisdom in the title refers to this ability to see through the noise. The world is full of people trying to make themselves appear more important, more mysterious, or more virtuous than they actually are. We create legends to cover up our mistakes, and we use social rules to mask our true intentions. We often find ourselves terrified by things that seem supernatural or inexplicable, when in reality the truth is much simpler and, in many ways, much more frightening. The monsters that Father Brown encounters are rarely the monsters of folklore. They aren't demons or ghosts. Instead, they are the very human impulses that exist within all of us. The greed that leads a man to kill for treasure, the envy that drives a person to destroy another's reputation, and the profound, desperate need to maintain a facade at any cost. The most impossible crimes are almost always just the result of these simple, earthly passions colliding in unexpected ways. Chesterton's stories suggest that while the world is indeed full of illusions and deceptions, the truth is always there, waiting to be found beneath the surface. You just have to be willing to look past the magic trick. You have to be willing to see the person behind the mask, even if that person is much more ordinary or much more flawed than you wanted them to be. Father Brown doesn't solve mysteries to prove he is clever. He solves them to reveal the truth of the human condition, reminding us that beneath all our disguises, we are all just people driven by the same ancient, complicated desires.